Hello, good to be back with you. Those of you who are new, I always hope there are some. My name's John Patrick. I'm a retired professor in biochemistry and pediatrics, but that was a long while ago. I left the university in 2000 because another career had emerged, talking to doctors and medical students around the world on issues of ethics, culture, faith, and public policy, and why we must get them all on the same page if we're going to survive. Much to my surprise, that has kept me busy ever since. So the starting point for today is a phrase that came into my head, as they do every now and again, which was biblical. What eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it entered the imagination of man, what the Lord has prepared for those who love him. This sense that at the beginning of human life in relation to God, it's not us going to God, it's God coming to us. And that is awesome. If you read the scriptures at all, you will be astonished by what happened if only we could still read, which most of us can't. The idea of reading a whole book through and then reading another one, which a gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, not many people would do that these days. But the young, fortunately, are getting anxious about life and they are doing it. Now, after the resurrection, Jesus told the disciples they had to go and wait until the Holy Spirit came. No reason given, but they spent a while, days, meeting together, talking, praying, reading the Old Testament, and then the Holy Spirit descended on them. And everything changed. The description, nobody would write as fiction because nobody would believe it. That when they started speaking to all the Jews who were in Israel at the time for the Passover meal, they heard them speak in their home language. They came from all over the Mediterranean, speaking many different languages. This wasn't speaking in tongues. This was hearing in your own tongue one particular word. No need for translation. It was done. An astonishing phenomenon. Now, nobody would describe that if it hadn't happened. It wouldn't make any sense. It happened. And it didn't happen again, although little bits of it can happen every now and again, which is astonishing. People hear things. Certainly they hear in a different way. So when the gospel comes to life, this phenomenon happens. And Jesus makes it very clear earlier in his conversation with Nicodemus, recorded in John 3, he says an extraordinary thing to Nicodemus, who was a very smart man, a university professor in those terms. But he realizes he can't teach and he can't speak like Jesus does. And he wants to know what the secret is. And Jesus knows that's why he's come. He comes at night because he doesn't want any of his colleagues to say that he's talking to this renegade who's undermining them from their point of view. So what? He still comes. He needs to know. And then Jesus gives the Irish answer, the non-answer. The Irishman asking, how do I get to Dublin from here? And the Irishman says, well, if I was you, I wouldn't start from here. Well, Nicodemus is asking Jesus, how do I teach like you? And he said, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from there. He says, unless and until you are born of the Spirit, you cannot comprehend what is going on. It's not in your power. You may be the most intelligent man on earth, but you will not understand this story in a life-changing way unless the Spirit comes to you, which, fortunately for us, the Spirit is willing to do, but only when he chooses it to be the right time. So, of course, it happens to Nicodemus, as his subsequent life shows. His life was turned around that evening. Whether he was aware of it immediately or not, I'm not sure. But everyone needs to stop and think, is there a point in my life where I saw things differently and I saw things Christianly? And if not, it's ask, seek, and knock. And in due course, you will get an answer. Sometimes he makes you hang around for a while. I mean, John Wesley believed the gospel story was true. He became an Anglican minister. He did everything right. He visited the poor. He visited prisoners. He prayed daily. He belonged to a Bible study reading group. You name it. He became a missionary, and he was simultaneously a pain in the backside. He didn't get it, really. And the Americans wisely sent him home. He comes home and very disappointed. I mean, all his own plans for his life had fallen apart at this point. And then, because he was an Anglican minister, he was asked to pray with some men who were going to be executed for murder, I presume. He doesn't say, but so he prayed with them and he told them the gospel. If you confess your sins, God is faithful and just to forgive you your sins and deliver you from all unrighteousness. And they gave thanks for the crucifixion, and they were immediately at peace. They went to their death without trouble. And Wesley wrote in his diary, "I can save others, but who will save me?" And then, most of you listening know the story, but for those that didn't, he was in London with his brother, Charles, the hymn writer. And Charles, who was also searching, had discovered a little Moravians. Anyway, a German-speaking group in a little chapel in Aldersgate Street. And there, Charles had seen it and himself experienced a deeper sense of meaning in terms of Christianity than he'd ever had before. And he said to John, "You have to go and listen to these people." And John rather scathingly said, "What are those people to teach me?" But he went. And then a man was not even reading the Bible. He was reading Luther's introduction to the Romans with a thick German accent. And yet suddenly, John Wesley says, as he was reading, for the first time in my life, I realized that I was a child of God. And his life changed. Not only his, but George Whitefield. So there in the 18th century, when London was in terrible state, drunkenness was at extraordinary levels because cheap gin had been introduced and life was tough and people were escaping into alcoholism with all the horrors that go with it. But Wesley and Whitefield felt the call of God to preach the gospel, not in church, but in the open air. And in weeks, the whole of England was changed. An astonishing phenomenon, which historians don't deal with because they don't like to deal with it. How do you deal with this? I mean, there's plenty of data. Whitefield, who was the greater preacher of the two, it gives an account, which I'm sure I've already spoken about at least once on this podcast, of going to preach to miners in open-cast mining pit because they were the most degraded people, and he felt the gospel should be preached. And as he preached, there's an account of someone watching and seeing white lines appear down the faces of the miners as the gospel penetrated. 6 weeks later, those miners asked Whitefield to come and have a meal with them and to lay the foundation of their own school. 6 weeks from total degradation to saying we need a school for our children. That's what the gospel can do. When it does it and how it does it are in God's hands. He's never in a hurry. Just look at how long and patient he was with his creation. Adam and Eve had a flying start in the Garden of Eden, and then they screwed up, were thrown out, and told very little advice. Adam, you're going to have to work. The sweat of your brow is how you will survive. Eve, you're going to be the mother of all flesh, and it's not going to be all fun. And the first 2 sons didn't get on, and one murdered the other. Again, not a flying start. But the line of people who understood who God was at a deeper level continued. But most people didn't. So a little while, and it was so bad, God said, I'm going to wipe you all out, except for Noah and his family. Give you a second try. Noah didn't start off well. He got into trouble. But it continued. The patriarchs came along, and Abraham knew who God was and left everything behind and travelled to a place he didn't know and lived in a tent for the rest of his life. It goes on. Still not much more than some individuals knowing God in a deeper way. Then Joseph goes to Egypt against his will and becomes the salvation for his family a little later, 20 odd years later. But still not great progress forward. Moses is called, doesn't want to go, but he goes, and the Jews are released from Egypt, where they were slaves. I've got the chronology a little screwed up there, but you can sort it out for yourself. And off they set, and they get to Mount Sinai, and God speaks to them. This is big stuff again, in a language they understand, their own. And he tells them what they have to do. And they say, okay, this is too much for us. They won't go near that mountain. They send Moses to talk to God, and he comes back with the Ten Commandments, which the liberal elite still hate, which tells you a lot about how important they are. If they're trivial nonsense, they'd shrug their shoulders and say, what difference does it make? It's because they're not trivial that people hate them, because if they're not trivial, they're true, and if they're true, we're all in trouble. That's the argument. It doesn't help the Jews that much. When he comes to the end of his life, Moses has had plenty of trouble on the way, and he tells them, you're going to have trouble. You remember what God said. He heard you say you'd obey, and he said, would that they would have such a heart and mind as this to keep my law, that it might go well with them and their children forever. Keeping that law is the basis of a culture that works. And it works in amazing ways. All grace, inexplicable why in one place and not in another. We don't understand. One day we will. That's the promise. And I have no reason not to believe that, like the others, it will ultimately come to be. But that sense of awe that can come from reading those stories and saying, this is so unlikely, but it happened. And then bringing it into your own life where these so unlikely things happen. Certainly happen to me. Not that often, just every now and again. But enough to remind you, whatever else, this is true. However much I screw up, which I do with monotonous regularity, the truth remains that we're on a journey to the point where when we see him, we shall be like him. I can't imagine what that's going to be like. That's where I think the eye hath not seen, ear has not heard, neither the imagination conceived of what God is planning for us. But somehow we know. So, from that cultural story, it has an impact on the people around. I mean, the Roman officials realized that these Christians were a problem. They weren't breaking the law, but they were living in a way which put the Roman government to shame. Nero tried to destroy them, but all he did was make martyrs of them. They didn't care. That early on in my life, I realized when I started reading history, this is astonishing. What happened should have destroyed Christianity, but instead it flourished, as it always has. I mean, the church is growing most rapidly at the moment in places like Iran and Indonesia and China. Whereas in the West, where we have free access to it, our elite have given up on it completely. They think they know better than God, and the evidence that they don't is just shown in their own lives. They can hardly manage their own families, let alone a government. The so-called elite are not an example that any of us will want to follow for our children as a group. Divorce is the norm. Family misbehavior is the norm. Unhappiness is the norm. Drug use is the norm. Sexual promiscuity with sexually transmitted disease is through the roof. We're in trouble. So the history that follows in the New Testament, very quickly, the gospel is preached. It's heard in ways that go much deeper than we understand. People say, I started to see the world in a different way. It hadn't changed, but my vision had changed. My understanding of what I should do changed. I had no idea what was going to happen to me when I said to a bunch of students after going to Africa for the first time, reading Alan Bloom on the way, and when I got there realizing, the science we did worked for malnourished children, but it wasn't working here. And I'd set up a program and was expecting it to work, but also aware that probably some things were happening that shouldn't happen. It should be easy. But when we came back after 9 months, it wasn't working. I'd already got myself into trouble with the students because when I came back from Africa on that first time, I'd said to them in a lecture on biochemistry, Alan Bloom is right, you're a bunch of ignoramuses. And the net result of that was I had an extracurricular course called Agnostics Anonymous, and I started just talking about what I did know. They kept coming. When I went back next time, I realized that Africans were new Christians and much more passionate about Christianity than we are, but they lived in a fading pagan story. Their book was the book of nature. There was no paper in Africa, so little writing. Paper is eaten by the insects anyway. Thank God for computers for keeping records in Africa. It makes it possible in places where paper wouldn't survive more than a few years. But they didn't do maintenance. I thought about it. They're so accepting of whatever happened. They'd shrug and get on with the shortest and easiest immediate response. Instead of sensing that if you want to build a better society, you've got to build some structures where people maintain things. Multiple mills were given by nice Americans within a relatively short distance of the hospital we used as a base, and most of them stopped working within a year or two because they didn't do maintenance. There was no spot in their mind, in the pagan mind, where maintenance shows up. And we're getting back to that now. We're not doing what we used to do. We're still living on the remains of Christianity that did do maintenance and that did build a society. And we're in denial of the history. Culture is what Christianity produces. The book of nature produces a culture. The Quran produces a culture. The Hindu writings produce a culture. The Tao produces a Chinese culture. They're all different. Whenever anybody talks about racism, I say, please give it a break. Let's talk about culture. That's what matters. You can't talk about race and then judge one race without being racist yourself. So that's no solution. The black racists don't even realize they're racist. They say the blacks can't be racist, but of course they are if that's the way they go. What they should have realized is this is not the right way to deal with the problem. The right way to deal with the problem is to start with human nature. That we all have in common. There's nobody listening to this podcast who could walk around with a bubble over their head with their thoughts on display for their family, their friends, the people they work with. They couldn't last a week because we all have things going on in our head which we don't immediately reject. And you see it come out in malice and gossip and all the trivial nonsenses, and then the much worse ones, brutality and murder and drugs and promiscuity and everything that destroys a society. That's where you have to start, because we own those things in common. Some of us have been blessed to grow up where that was in the family for a long while. I have a friend, for instance, who could trace the missionary in his family back to literally the 18th century without a break. That's a great blessing to have. It wouldn't even have occurred to me that a large number of cultures in the world, children would see their mother being abused, their sisters being abused. Sexual abuse is accepted in many cultures. It was unthinkable where I grew up, within the context of the church I went to every week, whether I wanted to or not. And what a blessing that was in retrospect, because I learned the scriptures. And in school, we had the scriptures read every day. There are stories being read to our children every day, whether we like it or not. Unfortunately, over the last 50-plus years, the dominant story has been portrayed by screens, and that's got worse with social media and the iPhone. Jonathan Haidt's evidence that it is destroying our children is obviously true. Everybody recognizes that. So the stories they get are not the ones that you want. So you see girls being pushed into sexualization very early and wanting to be that sort of person because those are the heroes that they see. I prefer the term heroine. They're heroines on screen. Not good news. Whereas when people grew up with the stories of the Bible, those stories fit. They stay too. And as God said by Moses, if you will keep these laws, if you will teach these stories to your children, if they can be the main source of your repeated ideas, the metaphors that make your society work, then you will flourish. Even the early cowboy stories were moral tales. The bad guy wore a black hat and the good guy wore a white hat, just so that you know who was the good guy and who was the white hat. The conventions of society were Judeo-Christian. That's no longer true. And now we worship violence. And that's a good question. I ask, why do we find it so attractive? We do. You only have to look at the consumption. And children, quite young, as soon as they get a screen, pornography will pop up on their screens and they watch it. I mean, I've only become aware of just how bad this is in the last little while. And when I first said it on a podcast, my family, someone said, you shouldn't say things like that. And I said, but if I don't say them, who will? Jonathan Haidt, I'm sure, has taken a lot of flack. But it's true. And just in the last year, I had a conversation which stopped me in my tracks with a young man who'd probably be about 17 or 18, working with a group of people trying to help black kids in the ghettos of Kingston who'd bailed out on education, therefore couldn't make a living. So he was teaching them with some colleagues how to be a plumber, electrician, and so on, a carpenter, things that they could do and earn a living. And talking to them after I'd given them a talk about what motivates you to do a good job, I was talking to this young man and I said, what proportion of the boys here watch pornography? And he said, all of us. And young people, boys, have seen pornography before they're sexually mature even. This is horrendous. This is the narrative. The elite who rule us want multiculturalism and tolerance to be the basis for a society. Neither of those two can work, and they're very interrelated. What makes a society work is what it will not tolerate. So where I grew up, attacks on women were not tolerated. They did not happen. At least if you lived in a working class area, a woman who shouted on the streets would have open doors come to protect her in no time flat. The abuser would not survive. All those norms came from the fact that the Bible was read in school every day. And of course, you Americans listening, you don't appreciate what a blessing your Constitution is. It's deeply biblical in origin. Even Ben Franklin, who didn't believe, certainly at that point, said, we better pray together because we'll certainly swing together if this doesn't work. If you have the Quran as your base and you take it very seriously, it means a woman is half as important in terms of evidence as a man, that you can beat your wife if she doesn't do exactly what you want. I mean, this is a different world. It's their book and it's their... Now, fortunately for them as well, I think, that book is undergoing the kind of criticism that Christianity went under with 19th century deism, and that did us some good because the churches that are surviving around the world are the ones that are, for want of a better word, more concerned about foundations and fundamentals. To be called a foundationalist is a terrible insult, but are you going to build your houses without foundations? That's where we've got to. The rituals that were put into our lives really help. Toronto was known not so very long ago as Toronto the Good, and the most likely time of a traffic jam was shortly before 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and the Sabbath was kept. The shops did not open. There was no sport. The same was true to a lesser extent in Britain. And the Sabbath is a good thing, as I now realize. I tell Christian students in going to university, if you want to survive with your faith intact in a culture that is opposed to Christianity at a gut level, so gets angry about it, certainly not academically distant from it. It doesn't begin to be like that. But one of the things you can do is keep the Sabbath. You need one day a week in which you allow the caustic environment of the university to diminish a bit because you don't engage with it. If you can't get through university on a 6-day week, you're heading towards a job that will crucify you, literally. Undergraduates should not be a problem, especially now that the thing has been so degraded that literally someone found in the last week or two a girl who'd got a degree from university and she couldn't read. That's beyond belief. Such is the desire to pass that they pass them anyway. It's disastrous. So the rituals that happen determine whether you can develop or not. I remember being there when a young man in Africa was told that he'd got a scholarship to go to America. And his response was interesting. He said, I'll have to go and ask the village whether I can go. Individualism didn't even appear on the horizon. There was a hierarchy in his village, and he had to get permission. That's not altogether bad, but it does stop individual development. All men can be very dismissive and oppressive towards young men who come along with ideas that undermine their ideas. That's still true, I can assure you. In the academic world at the moment, there are people who would suppress work that undermines what they've done, regardless as to whether the new work is better and truer. That's where we're at. If Darwin is right, as David Stowe points out, the only reason you have for doing anything at all is that it advantages your genes over everybody else's. That doesn't allow for the emergence of good and evil as real categories that have to be built into our politics. Now, deep down, because we're made in the image of God, we know that. And what's happening in Britain at the moment is astonishing. The liberal elite has said, you've got to tolerate Islam, but Islam is not prepared to tolerate Christianity. That's going to destroy us in the long run. You don't let people in who say our intention is to destroy your society. I mean, you take them seriously. Fortunately, ordinary people have some common sense, and they're saying, no, we can't go on the way we are. The grooming gangs are real, and they come from Pakistan, and they come dominantly from one part of Pakistan, not the whole. It's a subculture that has done that for time. Even girls are not safe in their own family. But infidel girls are open season. That's where it's at, and slowly it's being dealt with. It's at least coming into the open, and Muslims who know about it are beginning to say, yes, this is the problem we deal with. So the Islamic culture was materially ahead of everybody else for the so-called Golden Age, but the scholars of that period were not acceptable to the religious leaders, and the Golden Age didn't flourish. It died away. And not much was produced. They came close, but not close enough. The history of science, experimental science, which is the crown jewel of Western science, because it gives a criterion for, you say this happens, let me repeat the experiment. We're not repeating enough experiments at the moment. That's one of the problems. The new head of NIH says he wants to change that by actually funding repeating experiments that have real implications. What we need to understand about experimental science, and it's a key question we need to ask about almost every process. What do you need to believe in order to think that that process will work? In order to believe in an experiment done in a village where events that you don't like are put down to individual evil spirits, doesn't give you any basis for doing experiments. Different evil spirit, different outcome. That's what the thought that an experiment done in one continent would give the same result in another. That thought can only come if you believe there is order under the apparent chaos that our lives often are. That's why I follow David Lindbergh's suggestion that 1277 is a turning point, because that's when the idea of inductive reasoning came along. Now, there's an attack on inductive reasoning by the elite again because they don't like it. Because if inductive reasoning is the way we got to where we are, we need to ask the question, why did we believe it? It's been proved empirically since, so they say we don't need to discuss that. Well, you should. We think that we can create our own ways of dealing with these problems. We started ethics lectures in the 1980s in medical school. They didn't happen before that much. And why did we do it? Because behavior was slipping in some ways. The culture was thinning out. So we employed otherwise unemployable philosophers to teach the philosophy of ethics. And one of them said to me, I only teach ethics, I don't practice them. I'll leave you to think about that till next week, when hopefully computers will be working a little better. I hope my effort today hasn't gone entirely to waste. And I look forward to hearing from some of you. Have a good week.